While for the vast majority of time I feel pretty good, I do have episodes where I feel a little under the weather. It could be something as simple as a cold or an indicator of something more serious. I've got doctors and appointments and investigations happening, so if something is truly devastating, I'll know about it, or at least get warning that I'm heading down a dark direction medically. But instead of focusing on exactly what may or may not be the case, I like to use these sort of opportunities to knock myself out of complacency and think for a moment what sort of plans and future I visualize. Here are those plans. This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It, a podcast about technology, history, and getting myself out of debt. Thanks to Jeff Atwood, Daniel Boyd, and the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon and elsewhere who have been supporting me and helping me get out of debt. As time moves on from the epicenter of my heart attack, I realize how much it cleaved my life in two. A time when I thought that I was fine with an occasional health issue, to understanding that very quickly and without warning, my health could take a turn for the worse, and it would be a matter of rescuing or saving me more than maintenance or minor checkups. This dawning of realization made me move in several directions simultaneously. I started to realize that I had large collections that only had meaning to me. They were items that could be interesting, but their context wasn't clear. There weren't any records of specific arrangements I had made with any owners, whether I was the only owner, or whether they had a future designated for them as soon as I was done with them. The pure physical weight of materials that I had collected over 10 years were mostly easy to divest. Cathode ray tube monitors found a home. Computer systems or consoles either went to museums or to vintage computing groups. Stacks of magazines that I knew had been digitized completely found homes in other parts of the country, and the many different books that I had been sent found a home with the Internet Archive. The archive, in fact, had taken a huge amount of material off my hands and continues to. Materials that I think have to be digitized or held in trust should digitizing ever be necessary. A potential seed vault of material put inside of a shipping container, itself inside of a warehouse, itself held by a nonprofit. Some of these will see a future me take them out, digitize them, and put them onto the Internet Archive. Others may not. Either way, they're safe and not dependent on whether or not I get up in the morning. The remaining piles are relatively small: floppy disks, printouts, books, and my own personal items, all bundled up into tight boxes that somebody, maybe not me, will go through. When I mull over it, this clumping of items and objects, I start to realize how different my outlook has become. I used to be extraordinarily connected to physical things. I remember fights with people in my life if they in any way damaged or touched physical items I own, paper or materials I had set up just so. Boxes of cassette tapes and printouts and floppy disks, exquisitely labeled by me to indicate exactly what they were at the time, with the idea being that they weren't just my possessions, but were in their own way a library of me. Reference materials that I could pull from whenever I needed to prove a point, to recall a memory, to share with others. As I traveled from apartment to house to shared room to apartment, I realized how much of this I was keeping simply because I always had them. The fact that I still have oil paintings I did in one specific class at college just for an art credit tells me that I'm a few steps away from truly optimizing my possessions. That said, it has been a joy to find old sets of materials and bringing them online for others to enjoy, even if, for many years, I didn't see the point. As part of my work, I've stood at the crux of someone's collection, walking into a basement or a barn and realizing that for them, or their families, this is the great pivot, the pivot from acquisition to divestment, to giving up the ideal, whether it was ever thought out or just the way things worked out, of what their own archives were going to be. In some cases, the next steps for me are clear. These will be scanned and put online. Other times, the items are a jumble, a disorganized mess, representing merely decades of gathering without any clear goal in mind. But through these many projects that I've been part of, one rule is clear. Ends are messy. Extraordinarily rarely, we might see a well-planned end, a properly done shutting down of resources, of the closing of a storage space, of the end of a warehouse. But usually, pretty much always, that's never the case. What we see instead is a chaotic anarchy of people coming in, pulling what they need, or transporting it into another group, and what was once a beautiful space or collection is suddenly an empty box strewn with pieces of paper, dusty and with all of its intentions and its plans scattered to the winds. I had a revelation recently listening to way too many episodes of Defunctland in realizing that park rides had a lifespan, that a roller coaster is built shiny and new, and due to unexpected stresses needs tune-ups and fixes in its first few years, and then it persists for a while until eventually, a few decades down the line, it's time for that ride, that roller coaster, to either be discarded or completely rebuilt into something completely different. And such it is with archives and collections. A presentation of old vintage consoles within somebody's self-imagined playroom becomes a box of those same games, sorted for rarity, uniqueness, maybe even resale, and carted away. In New Jersey, I walked the auction of a collector who was divesting himself of all of his materials. I took pictures because I was not in a mode to grab more things, but I did marvel at the variation, the differences of what had been collected over the years. Video game consoles, software collections, gadgets and toys, very likely representing different phases of interest and contributions from friends and fans, until finally that pivot, that end, had come to rest for that collector. They didn't attend the auction. This was no longer part of their story. Instead, the materials were gone, the chapter was closed, and sometime in the future, a check was going to come, representing not the sale of what had been, but funding of what was to be. That's how I work all of this out. These days, I'm progressing through lots of different projects, digitizing videotapes and floppies and CD-ROMs, moving through collections on the Internet Archive to make them easier to use, finishing up little tasks that I had worked on a few years ago and set aside, either deciding to finish them or realizing they never had a chance to be finished and coming to terms with that. A series, really, of doors closing, of paths not being taken, of directions that I have ruled out and futures I won't be experiencing. Faced as I've been with a few rounds of not feeling well, which I stress are not painful or shocking, but likely small parts of age and change, I sit back and I think about what potential futures I want to be part of and what's missing should my futures never come. It's a good exercise to do. It helps bring into focus and perspective what I want to do. And here's where I'm sitting with this. Increasing communication, not just about talking, but about things I want people to know or want to share with them. Figuring out exactly which projects and goals are far beyond my ability as an individual, and where I can put down on paper my idea and my plan for what could happen, knowing it might be discarded, ignored, never picked up. And making sure, as I've been doing for most of my life, that the way I spend my days is not one that I hate or regret or feel guilty about, that I live my days appreciating the precious aspects, and in its stead leave behind inspiration, smiles, and hopes. This isn't me saying goodbye. This is me saying hello and asking, how can I make things better? This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It, thanks to James Bekoyanu, Hosea Lucier, Mark Pilgrim, Emilio Oliveira, Ernie Hershey, Michael Rubin, Matt Reynolds, Sean Kelly, John Sturm, Eric Vitello, Trixie the Cat, Dileep Reddy, and Anonymous, along with the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon and elsewhere who have been supporting me and helping me get out of debt. A few years ago, at one of the Internet Archive events, which are held in October to celebrate getting through another year, I was visiting the different stalls that we had in the outside street fair we had set up, and picking up a snack from one of my coworkers, I asked where the cheese was, and she told me, "Oh, we don't have that anymore, thanks to cheese hands." And I said, "What do you mean, cheese hands?" And she told me that they had 2 large trays of cheese for nachos over a sterno fire so it was melted, and somebody had walked into the street fair, walked up to the stall, put both of their hands directly into the cheese, and walked away, 2 yellow steaming orbs where their hands had been. Naturally, the nacho cheese was over for that year, and every year hence. Such was the legend and the story of cheese hands. And if I'm asking for one thing, if I've said one thing for this episode, it's trying to get through life, to be part of the street fair, to be part of the joy and the celebration. And if you can control yourself, please do not become cheese hands.